This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this journey through Lesotho, the remarkable kingdom in the sky. Nestled high in the mountains of southern Africa, this small nation stands entirely above 1,000 meters elevation, the only country on Earth to do so. In the next few minutes, we'll explore Lesotho's dramatic landscapes, rich cultural heritage, and the resilient Basotho people who call these highlands home. From its unique geography and fascinating history to its vibrant traditions and modern challenges, discover why this landlocked mountain kingdom, completely surrounded by South Africa, captivates all who encounter it. Let's begin our exploration of Lesotho. Chapter 1. The Kingdom in the Sky. High in the heart of southern Africa, where the air grows thin and the sky stretches impossibly blue, lies a nation unlike any other on Earth. Lesotho stands alone in the global atlas as the only independent country where every single square meter of territory sits more than 1,000 meters above sea level. This is not merely a geographical curiosity. It is a defining reality that shapes every aspect of life for the more than 2 million Basotho people who call this vertical realm home. Picture, if you will, standing at the lowest point in Lesotho, where the Orange River meets the Makaling River near the border with South Africa. You were standing at 1,400 meters above sea level. This spot, the absolute floor of the entire nation, towers higher than the highest peaks of 93 countries around the world. The summit of Ben Nevis in Scotland reaches only 1,345 meters. Mount Fuji's famous profile dominates Japan at 3,776 meters, yet much of Japan sits at sea level. In Lesotho, there is no sea level. There are no coastal plains, no river deltas spreading toward ocean waves, no gradual descent from highlands to lowlands to shores. Instead, the nation exists entirely in the realm of mountains, plateaus, and sky. The Basotho have a saying that captures this reality perfectly. They call their homeland the Kingdom in the Sky, and anyone who has driven the winding roads through the Maloti Mountains or looked out across the seemingly endless peaks of the Drakensberg Range understands why. Some have called it the Switzerland of southern Africa, though this comparison, while flattering, fails to capture the unique character of Lesotho's landscape. Switzerland has valleys that drop to modest elevations. Lesotho has no such escape from altitude. The entire nation hangs suspended in the sky, a kingdom of stone and grass perched on the rooftop of Africa. To understand Lesotho's geography is to understand why it exists as an independent nation at all. The country covers 30,355 square kilometers, roughly the size of Maryland in the United States or Belgium in Europe. But this modest area contains some of the most dramatic topography on the African continent. Over 80% of Lesotho's total territory lies above 1,800 meters elevation, meaning that the vast majority of the country exists in what would be considered high mountain terrain anywhere else in the world. Lesotho is completely surrounded by the Republic of South Africa, making it one of only 3 countries in the world that exist as enclaves within another nation. The other 2, San Marino and Vatican City, are tiny European states. Lesotho is something altogether different, a genuine mountain kingdom carved from the highlands of southern Africa. The formation of Lesotho as a distinct political entity in the 1820s under King Moshoe I was no accident of history. The Basotho people understood that these mountains offered natural fortification against external threats. When Boer settlers pushed inland from the Cape Colony and Zulu armies swept across the lowlands during the violent upheavals of the early 19th century, the Basotho retreated into the highlands and made the mountains their fortress. King Moshoe established his stronghold at Tababosiu, a flat-topped mountain near present-day Maseru that could be defended against superior forces. The geography itself became the nation's primary defense, and it remains central to Lesotho's identity today. The topography of Lesotho can be divided into 3 distinct geographical zones, each defined by elevation and each supporting different patterns of human settlement and economic activity. The western quarter of the country constitutes the lowlands, though this term is deeply relative. These so-called lowlands sit between 1,500 and 1,800 meters above sea level, higher than many mountain peaks in other parts of the world. Here, the landscape consists of rolling hills and relatively flat plains formed from sandstone geology. The soil, particularly in the western lowlands, suffers from severe erosion due to decades of intensive agricultural use. Despite this degradation, the lowlands remain the most productive agricultural zone in the country. Approximately 70% of Lesotho's population lives in this narrow western strip, clustering in villages and small towns that spread along the border with South Africa. The capital city, Maseru, sits in this zone at the edge of the Caledon River, which forms the natural boundary between Lesotho and the Free State Province of South Africa. Moving eastward and upward, the landscape transitions into the foothill zone, where elevations range from 1,800 to 2,200 meters. This middle belt serves as a transitional area between the relatively gentle lowlands and the dramatic highlands that dominate the eastern 2/3 of the country. The foothills present a landscape of increasing ruggedness, where rivers have carved deep valleys into the underlying rock and where the first serious mountains begin to assert themselves. Villages in the foothills are more scattered and isolated than those in the lowlands, often accessible only by rough dirt tracks or on horseback. The famous Lesotho pony, a hardy breed descended from Arabian and European horses, evolved specifically to navigate this challenging terrain. But it is in the highlands where Lesotho's geography achieves its most spectacular expression. The eastern and central regions of the country rise into the Maloti Mountains and the Drakensberg Range, where peaks routinely exceed 3,000 meters and the landscape takes on an almost alpine character. The highest point in Lesotho, and indeed in all of southern Africa, is Thabanantlanyana, which reaches 3,482 meters above sea level. Standing at this summit, a visitor can see across vast distances in every direction, looking down on layer after layer of peaks that fade into blue haze at the horizon. The air at this altitude is cold and thin, with weather that can shift from bright sunshine to snow squalls within the span of an hour. The implications of this extraordinary elevation are profound and far-reaching. Agriculture becomes more challenging as altitude increases, with shorter growing seasons and the constant threat of frost, even during summer months. Only about 12% of Lesotho's total area consists of arable land, a severe limitation for a nation whose population still depends heavily on subsistence farming. Transportation infrastructure requires constant maintenance as roads battle against extreme weather and difficult terrain. Communities in the highlands often experience isolation during winter months when snow closes mountain passes and makes travel impossible for days or even weeks at a time. The geological foundation of Lesotho's mountains tells the story of ancient volcanic activity and millions of years of erosion. The highlands are composed primarily of basalt, a dark volcanic rock that forms rich soils when weathered. These basaltic soils of the highlands are among the best in the country for agriculture, though the steep slopes and high elevation limit their practical use. In contrast, the lowlands rest on layers of sandstone that erode more easily and produce less fertile soils. The dramatic landscape we see today results from countless millennia of rivers cutting through these different rock layers, creating the deep valleys, towering cliffs, and distinctive flat-topped mountains that characterize Lesotho's topography. The contrast between the dark basalt of the highlands and the lighter sandstone of the lowlands is visible even from a distance, marking the transition between geological zones. Water defines the landscape of Lesotho as much as stone. The mountains act as a massive water tower for southern Africa, capturing moisture from weather systems that sweep across the region and channeling it into rivers that flow year-round even during periods of drought. The Orange River, one of the major river systems of southern Africa, originates in the mountains of Lesotho. So does the Tugela River, which flows eastward into KwaZulu-Natal, and numerous tributaries of the Caledon River. This abundance of water in an otherwise water-scarce region has made Lesotho strategically valuable to its neighbor, South Africa, and led to the development of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, one of the largest engineering undertakings in Africa. Walking through the highlands of Lesotho, one encounters a landscape that seems almost primordial in its stark beauty. The vegetation consists primarily of hardy grasses adapted to cold temperatures and thin soils. Trees are rare, limited mostly to valleys and protected areas where they have been deliberately planted. The natural treelessness of the landscape results from a combination of factors, including altitude, climate, historical overgrazing, and human activity. For generations, Basotho families have harvested what little wood was available for fuel and construction, leaving the mountains bare. Reforestation efforts using fast-growing eucalyptus trees have had some success, but much of the country remains dramatically treeless, giving the landscape an exposed, windswept character. The climate of Lesotho varies dramatically with altitude and season, creating microclimates that can differ substantially even within relatively small areas. The lowlands around Maseru receive an average of 71 centimeters of rainfall annually, concentrated in the summer months between October and April. The mountains can receive up to 191 centimeters of precipitation, much of it falling as snow during the winter months. Summer temperatures in the lowlands regularly reach 30 degrees Celsius and occasionally climb past 35 degrees during heat waves. But travel an hour eastward into the mountains, and the temperature drops noticeably with each 100 meters of elevation gain. In winter, which runs from June through August in the southern hemisphere, temperatures in the lowlands can drop to -7 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze water pipes and coat the landscape in frost. In the highlands, winter temperatures routinely plunge below -18 degrees Celsius. Snow is common in the highlands between May and September, and the higher peaks can experience snowfall year-round. The snowpack can persist for months in shaded valleys and on south-facing slopes, transforming the landscape into a winter wonderland that seems incongruous in Africa. This snow is not merely a curiosity. It is a defining feature of life in highland Lesotho. Every winter, the mountains turn white, and highland communities must prepare carefully for isolation. Families stockpile food and fuel, accepting that travel may become impossible until spring arrives. Herders move their livestock to lower elevations or build stone shelters called kraals to protect animals from the worst of the winter weather. Some villages remain cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time, accessible only by helicopter or on foot for those brave enough to trek through the snow. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the highlands of Lesotho possess a haunting beauty that draws visitors from around the world. The Afri-Ski Mountain Resort, located at more than 3,000 meters elevation in the Maloti Mountains, operates as one of only a handful of ski resorts in all of Africa. During the winter months, skiers from South Africa and further afield come to experience the novelty of skiing on African snow, carving turns down slopes that look out across seemingly endless mountain vistas. The resort represents an attempt to diversify Lesotho's economy through tourism, though the remoteness and challenging access limit its growth potential. The geographical reality of Lesotho creates profound challenges for infrastructure development. Building roads through mountainous terrain costs far more per kilometer than construction on flat land. Yet the country needs these roads to connect isolated highland communities with markets and services in the lowlands. Maintaining these roads requires constant work as frost heaves crack pavement in winter and summer storms wash out bridges and culverts. The rugged topography also makes it difficult and expensive to extend electricity grids and telecommunications networks into remote areas. Despite these obstacles, the Basotho have adapted to their mountainous homeland with remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Villages perch on hillsides and valley floors, their traditional roundhouses with conical thatched roofs blending into the landscape. Stone corrals for livestock dot the slopes. Narrow footpaths wind across the mountains, worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves. Highland shepherds, wrapped in traditional Basotho blankets against the cold, tend their flocks on high pastures during summer months, moving with the seasons in patterns that have changed little over centuries. The geographical isolation imposed by Lesotho's mountains has both preserved and challenged traditional culture. On one hand, the difficulty of external access helped the Basotho maintain their cultural identity and language during the colonial period and beyond. The mountains served as a refuge where traditions could continue without being completely overwhelmed by outside influences. On the other hand, isolation means limited economic opportunities, pushing many Basotho to seek work in South African mines and cities, creating a pattern of labor migration that has profoundly shaped Lesotho's society and economy for more than a century. Standing at the edge of the escarpment where the highlands drop away toward the lowlands, looking out across the rumpled landscape of peaks and valleys extending to every horizon, one grasps the fundamental truth of Lesotho. This is a country defined by its geography in ways few other nations can match. The mountains are not merely a backdrop to human activity. They are the primary factor shaping where people live, how they make their living, what challenges they face, and what possibilities they can imagine for the future. The kingdom in the sky is not a poetic metaphor. It is a precise description of a nation that exists entirely in the vertical realm, where altitude determines destiny, and the geography itself becomes inseparable from national identity. Chapter 2, Democracy and the Ceremonial Crown. On the 7th of February 1996, a young man who had already served as king once before ascended to the throne of Lesotho for the second time. King Letsie III was 32 years old, thrust back into the role of monarch following his father's death in a car accident just weeks earlier. His father, King Moshoshu II, had driven off a mountain road in the Maludi Mountains during the early hours of the morning, plunging to his death in circumstances that some Basotho found suspicious but which were officially ruled accidental. For Letsie, this was not his first experience with the strange dance between power and powerlessness that defines constitutional monarchy in Lesotho. The young king had first worn the crown from November 1990 to January 1995, installed by military leaders who had forced his father into exile. Then, after complex negotiations, he had abdicated to allow his father's return. Now, with his father gone, Letsie assumed the throne again, this time permanently. He remains King of Lesotho today, but the title carries far less authority than it might suggest. In the constitutional system established in 1993, the king serves a largely ceremonial function as head of state and symbol of national unity. He possesses no executive authority and is specifically prohibited from actively participating in political initiatives. The monarch may not even vote in elections. This careful separation of royal symbolism from political power represents a deliberate choice by Lesotho's political architects, but it was not easily achieved. The path from traditional African monarchy to modern constitutional system winds through decades of political turbulence, military coups, exiles, and violence. Following independence in October 1966, the new Kingdom of Lesotho established a constitutional monarchy with King Moshosho II as head of state. Liabwa Jonathan, leader of the Basotho National Party, became prime minister and head of government. This arrangement functioned reasonably well until the first post-independence elections in January 1970, when Jonathan's party lost to the Basotho Congress Party. The BCP won 36 seats, while the BNP secured only 23. What happened next set a pattern that would haunt Lesotho's politics for decades. Jonathan simply refused to accept the results. Instead of peacefully transferring power, he declared a state of emergency, suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and imprisoned opposition leaders. He declared himself Tona Kolo, a Sesotho term meaning prime minister, but now wielded the title without democratic mandate. King Moshosho II found himself sidelined and eventually forced into exile, allowed to return only after agreeing to validate the annulled elections and accept his diminished role. For 16 years, from 1970 to 1986, Jonathan ruled by decree, maintaining power through political patronage, intimidation, and backing from South Africa's apartheid government. His regime developed increasingly authoritarian characteristics. In 1981, gunmen attacked the family of opposition figure Benjamin Masilo, killing his 3-year-old grandson. 4 days later, Edgar Maholola Motuba, editor of the newspaper Lesanikana La Lesotho, was abducted from his home along with 2 friends. All 3 were murdered, sending a clear message about the costs of opposing the government. The end came on January 20, 1986. General Justin Metzing Lakanya led a military coup that overthrew Jonathan and installed a military council to govern. The coup leaders claimed they were restoring order and made a significant symbolic gesture by returning executive authority to King Moshosho II. For a brief period, Lesotho operated under military rule, with the king possessing real political power. But this arrangement proved immediately unstable. The relationship between Lakanya and the king soured quickly. In 1987, Moshosho drafted a memorandum outlining constitutional reforms that would give him greater executive powers. The military government rejected this proposal, seeing it as a threat to their authority. Lakanya forced the king into exile, sending him to London. In his place, the military installed his son, the young Letsi, as King Letsi III. The prince was 27 years old, educated at the National University of Lesotho and Cambridge, suddenly occupying a throne from which his father had been expelled. Lakanya himself lasted only until April 1991, when junior officers staged another coup and replaced him with Colonel Elias Fisawana Ramaema. This new military leader proved more amenable to democratic transition, promising to restore civilian government and hold free elections. King Mohishoa II returned from exile in 1992, though initially as an ordinary citizen while his son continued as king. In April 1993, Lesotho held elections that international observers deemed reasonably free and fair. The Basotho Congress Party swept all 65 seats in the National Assembly. BCP leader Nsu Mokele became prime minister. The military withdrew to barracks. A new constitution, promulgated on April 2, 1993, established the framework that governs Lesotho today. This constitution restored multi-party democracy and carefully defined the monarchy as ceremonial rather than executive. It created an independent judicial system comprising the High Court, the Court of Appeal, magistrates' courts, and traditional courts that exist predominantly in rural areas. The Constitution also established protections for civil liberties, including freedom of speech, association, press, peaceful assembly, and religion. The parliamentary system consists of 2 chambers. The National Assembly has 120 members. 80 are elected directly from single-member constituencies in a first-past-the-post system. The remaining 40 seats are allocated proportionally based on each party's share of the national vote. This mixed system, however, was not part of the original 1993 framework. It was added later, after crisis demonstrated the dangers of allowing a single party to monopolize representation. The Senate, the upper house, has 33 members. 22 are hereditary chiefs whose membership passes through traditional lineages, while 11 are appointed by the king, acting on advice of the prime minister. The Senate reviews legislation but has limited powers compared to the National Assembly. Yet the young King Letsi III was not satisfied with his ceremonial role under the new constitution. He wanted his father restored as king. When the BCP government refused, tensions escalated. In August 1994, Letsie backed a military coup that dissolved parliament and deposed the government. The international community refused to recognize this action. The Southern African Development Community sent mediators who negotiated a deal. The BCP government would be restored, and in exchange, King Moshoeshoe II would return to the throne. In January 1995, Letsie abdicated in favor of his father. 1 year later, Moshoeshoe II was dead, killed in that car accident in the Maloti Mountains. Some Basotho suspected foul play, noting that the king had been driving alone at 1 o'clock in the morning to visit his cattle, which seemed unusual. The official investigation ruled it an accident. Letsie, who had spent barely a year as a private citizen, became king again. King Letsie III married Anna Karabo Motsoeneng in February 2000 in a ceremony that blended traditional Basotho customs with modern royal pageantry. She became Queen Masenate Mohato Sieso. Together they have 3 children. The king maintains a relatively low public profile, appearing at national ceremonies, receiving foreign dignitaries, and serving as a symbol of national unity without attempting to exercise political power. He has become skilled at the delicate art of being present without interfering, visible without being powerful. Executive power resides with the Prime Minister and Cabinet. The Prime Minister is typically the leader of the largest party in the National Assembly, or the leader of a coalition that commands a majority. The king appoints the Prime Minister, but this appointment is not a matter of royal discretion. The king must appoint whoever can demonstrate majority support in Parliament. Cabinet ministers are then appointed by the Prime Minister. In theory, this constitutional framework should produce stable democratic governance. In practice, Lesotho's politics have remained turbulent and frequently violent. The elections of May 1998 provided a stark demonstration of the system's fragility. By this point, Prime Minister Mokhele had left the BCP and formed a new party, the Lesotho Congress for Democracy. In the election, the LCD won an overwhelming 79 of the 80 constituency seats, a virtual clean sweep. Pakalitha Mosisili, who had succeeded Mokhele as party leader, became prime minister. Opposition parties immediately cried foul, claiming the election had been rigged. Protests erupted in Maseru and other towns. By August, large crowds gathered outside the royal palace, demanding that results be overturned. The situation spiraled toward chaos as members of the military began to mutiny. Elements of the Lesotho Defense Force seized weapons and prepared to overthrow the government. Fearing complete collapse, Mosisili's government requested military intervention from neighboring countries under the framework of SADC. On September 22, 1998, South African troops entered Lesotho, soon joined by forces from Botswana. The intervention succeeded in putting down the military mutiny and preventing a coup, but at significant cost. Fighting broke out between South African soldiers and Lesotho Defense Force units. When South African troops raised their national flag over the royal palace, Basotho crowds rioted. Shops and businesses in Maseru were looted and burned. By the time SADC forces withdrew in May 1999, much of the capital's commercial district lay in ruins. This crisis led directly to the electoral reforms that created the current mixed system. The proportional component was specifically designed to prevent any single party from again winning 79 of 80 constituency seats, while opposition parties captured significant shares of the popular vote but received almost no representation. The reforms also established an interim political authority to review electoral procedures and build confidence in the system. These changes helped reduce immediate tensions, but did not resolve underlying problems of weak institutions and political competition for scarce resources. Pakalitha Mosisili served as prime minister from 1998 until 2012, an unusually long period of relative stability. Elections in 2002 under the new mixed system allowed opposition parties to gain seats, reducing their incentive to reject results violently. But when Mosisili's LCD finally lost power in 2012, the country entered another period of instability. Tom Thabane, leader of the All-Basotho Convention, formed a coalition government and became prime minister. Thabane's first term lasted only until March 2015, when his coalition collapsed and Mosili returned as prime minister. Then, in June 2017, Thabane came back again after elections gave his party a plurality. This alternation might seem like normal democratic rotation, except that it was punctuated by violence and allegations of coups. The most dramatic incident occurred on August 30, 2014. Armed soldiers attacked police installations in the capital, allegedly attempting a military coup. Thabane fled to South Africa, claiming his life was in danger. General Tlai Kamoli, the army commander whom Thabane had recently tried to remove, denied any coup had taken place. Thabane returned after 3 days, but the incident raised serious questions about civilian control over the military. SADC once again intervened diplomatically. The most sordid chapter in recent politics involves the murder of Thabane's former wife, Lipolelo Thabane. On the night of June 14, 2017, just 2 days before Thabane was sworn in for his second term as prime minister, gunmen shot and killed Lipolelo outside her home in Maseru. She and Thabane were divorcing. Thabane married his current wife, Maezia Thabane, at a large public ceremony in 2018. Then in January 2020, police investigating the murder discovered that someone had made phone calls from near the crime scene to a phone registered to the prime minister. Maezia was charged with murder. A court ordered Thabane himself to appear for questioning. The scandal paralyzed the government. Coalition partners demanded Thabane's resignation. SADC sent mediators. Finally, on May 20, 2020, Thabane formally stepped down as prime minister at age 81. His finance minister, Moketsi Mahoro, succeeded him, promising to restore stability. Mahoro kept a coalition together until 2022, when he resigned after losing a vote of no confidence. The murder charges against Thabane were eventually dropped in 2022, though questions about the killing remain. The elections of October 7, 2022, brought another dramatic change. A new party called Revolution for Prosperity, founded just months earlier by Sam Matekane, won 56 of the 120 National Assembly seats. Matekane, a wealthy diamond mining entrepreneur, had funded a sophisticated campaign heavy on social media, promising to fight corruption, improve the economy, and depoliticize the security forces. On October 28, 2022, he was sworn in as prime minister, leading a coalition government. He remains in office today. Throughout all this political turbulence, King Letsi III has remained a constant presence, carefully avoiding any appearance of taking sides. When prime ministers come and go, when coalition governments form and collapse, when allegations of corruption and murder dominate headlines, the king appears at state occasions wearing traditional dress or military uniform, receiving credentials from foreign ambassadors, opening parliament, and maintaining the symbolic continuity of the Basotho nation. His role requires delicate judgment about when to speak and when to remain silent, when to be visible and when to withdraw. The constitutional monarchy system in Lesotho represents an attempt to preserve respect for traditional leadership while embracing democratic governance. The king embodies the nation's history and cultural identity. Parliament and the Prime Minister manage the actual business of governance. In theory, this division allows both tradition and modernity to coexist. In practice, it works imperfectly, as repeated crises demonstrate. Yet, for all its flaws, the system has survived. Lesotho has not descended into prolonged civil war or complete state collapse, though it has come close at times. The combination of constitutional rules, international pressure from SADC, and the stabilizing symbolic presence of the monarchy has proven just resilient enough to keep the country functioning through repeated crises. The kingdom in the sky remains, improbably, a democracy. Chapter 3: Economic Vulnerability and Dependence. In the early morning hours of February 2025, thousands of women gathered outside the textile factories in the industrial zones of Masuru and Maputswe, waiting anxiously for news that never came. The factories remained dark and silent. Over the previous weeks, orders from American retailers had been abruptly canceled. The U.S. government, under President Donald Trump's administration, had imposed sweeping tariffs on African textiles as part of what they called Liberation Day trade policy. Within days, the economic lifeline that had employed more than 50,000 Basotho workers, the vast majority of them women, simply evaporated. Mamelo Nathako had worked at one of these factories for 12 years, sewing jeans destined for Walmart stores across America. She was 34 years old, a single mother of 3 children, and her monthly wage of approximately $120 represented the primary income for her entire extended family. When the factory closed, she received no severance pay, no notice beyond a few days, and no prospect of comparable employment anywhere else in Lesotho. She was not alone. Across the country, tens of thousands of textile workers found themselves suddenly unemployed, their families plunged deeper into poverty, their futures uncertain. This sudden collapse of the textile industry was merely the latest and most dramatic episode in a much longer story of economic vulnerability and dependence that defines life in Lesotho. Understanding the kingdom's economy requires understanding a fundamental and uncomfortable truth. Lesotho is almost completely reliant on its larger neighbor, South Africa, for its economic survival, while simultaneously struggling to create sufficient opportunities for its own people. The basic statistics paint a bleak picture, but they only hint at the daily struggles faced by ordinary Basotho families. Approximately 49% of the population lives below the international poverty line, defined as $1.25 per day. Think about what that means in practical terms. A family of 5 living on less than $6 per day cannot afford adequate nutrition, cannot pay school fees for all their children, cannot maintain decent housing, cannot save for emergencies, cannot escape the grinding anxiety of wondering where tomorrow's food will come from. The unemployment rate tells an equally troubling story, though the exact figure depends on how one counts. Official estimates range from 25 to 45%, but these numbers obscure as much as they reveal. Many Basotho engage in informal economic activities that don't appear in official employment statistics. A woman who sells vegetables by the roadside, a man who repairs shoes in a market stall, a teenager who watches neighbors' cattle for small payments are all working, but none would count as formally employed. The formal sector, the realm of regular wages and stable jobs, employs a fraction of the workforce. For those who do find formal employment, the options are limited and often precarious. The government remains the single largest employer in the country, but public sector wages are modest and the government faces constant budget pressures. The public sector wage bill already consumes approximately 23% of GDP, among the highest percentages in all of sub-Saharan Africa, leaving little room for expansion. Manufacturing, primarily the textile and garment industry, employed significant numbers until recently, but has contracted dramatically. Mining, particularly diamond mining, at operations like Letseng, Mothe, Likobong, and Kau in the mountains, provides some well-paying jobs but employs relatively few people. Letseng is notable for producing diamonds with the highest dollar ratio per carat of any diamond mine in the world, generating substantial revenue but limited employment. Agriculture occupies the majority of the rural population, but generates little income because most farming is subsistence level, producing barely enough food for families to eat with nothing left over to sell. This brings us to the central fact of Lesotho's economic existence, complete dependence on South Africa. Geographic encirclement translates into economic encirclement. Lesotho imports approximately 85 to 90% of the goods its people consume from South Africa. Walk through any store in Masuru and you will find South African bread, South African sugar, South African cooking oil, South African clothing, South African electronics, South African everything. The country produces almost none of its own manufactured goods and grows less than 20% of the food its population needs. This import dependence flows partly from Lesotho's membership in the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, which also includes South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, and Namibia. Under SACU rules, goods move freely across borders within the Union without tariffs, and customs revenues are shared among member states according to a formula that tends to favor smaller economies. These SACU revenues represented approximately 26% of Lesotho's total GDP in 2016, making them the second largest source of government income after tax collection. But SACU payments fluctuate based on South Africa's economic performance and trade patterns, creating unpredictability in Lesotho's budget planning. When South Africa's economy slows or its import levels decline, SACU revenues to Lesotho fall, forcing the government to cut spending or borrow more. But customs revenues tell only part of the story of Lesotho's dependence on South Africa. Even more fundamental is the flow of people across the border in search of work. For more than a century, tens of thousands of Basotho men have crossed into South Africa to work in gold and diamond mines. At the peak of this system, in the 1980s and 1990s, approximately 60% of Lesotho's active male wage earners worked in South Africa. These migrant workers would leave their families for months at a time, living in mining compounds under harsh conditions, sending money home to support parents, wives, and children. The mining work was dangerous and difficult, but it paid significantly better than anything available in Lesotho. A miner might earn enough in a year to support his family, pay for his children's education, and gradually accumulate savings toward buying cattle or improving his home. The system created a pattern where rural Lesotho villages were populated primarily by women, children, and elderly men, while the working-age men lived abroad. This separation strained marriages, disrupted family structures, and created a generation of children who barely knew their fathers. The scale of mining employment has declined substantially since the 1990s as South African mines mechanized operations and reduced their workforce. By the 2010s, the number of Basotho miners had dropped to around 25,000, less than half the previous peak. Yet even this reduced number remains significant for Lesotho's economy. In 2001, remittances from workers abroad totaled approximately $113 million, equivalent to 26% of GDP, the highest ratio of remittances to GDP of any country in the world at that time. These remittances represented a larger share of national income than all of Lesotho's exports combined. Think about what this means for individual families. Thabo Malapo works in a gold mine near Welcome in South Africa's Free State Province. He is 42 years old and has been a miner for 18 years. He comes home to his village in Mafeteng district 4 times per year for 2 weeks each time. His wife, Mapule, manages their household, raises their 4 children, tends their small garden plot, and makes all the day-to-day decisions about family life. The money Thabo sends home every month, approximately $350, keeps the family fed, clothed, and housed. It pays school fees for the children. It covers medical expenses when someone falls ill. Without Thabo's mining wages, the family would face immediate destitution. But the cost of this economic survival strategy is measured in years of separation, in children who grow up barely knowing their father, in marriages strained by distance and loneliness. The migrant labor system extends beyond mining. Thousands of Basotho work in South African cities as domestic workers, security guards, shop assistants, construction laborers, and farm workers. Some cross the border legally with work permits. Others work without documentation, vulnerable to exploitation and deportation. All of them contribute to the flow of remittances that sustains families back in Lesotho's villages and towns. A different form of dependence emerged through the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, which transfers water from Lesotho's mountain rivers to South Africa's industrial heartland. This massive engineering project, begun in the 1980s and expanded over subsequent decades, generates revenue through water royalties and hydroelectric power sales. By 2010, these sales brought in approximately $70 million annually. The project also made Lesotho almost completely self-sufficient in electricity production, a significant achievement for a small country. Yet even this success reinforces dependence, as South Africa remains the sole customer for the water, and the revenue stream depends entirely on that bilateral relationship. Against this backdrop of dependency and migration, the rise of the textile industry in the late 1990s and early 2000s seemed to offer a different path. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 2000, allowed eligible African countries to export certain goods to the United States without paying tariffs. Lesotho seized this opportunity aggressively. Investors, many of them from Taiwan and China, established garment factories in industrial parks around Maseru, Maputswe, and other towns. These factories imported fabric, often from Asia, and Lesotho workers cut and sewed the fabric into finished garments, primarily jeans, t-shirts, and other casual wear, which were then exported to the American market. The industry grew with remarkable speed. By 2004, textile and garment manufacturing employed more than 50,000 workers, making it the largest formal sector employer in the country, surpassing even the government. For the first time in Lesotho's history, more people worked in factories than as migrant laborers in South African mines. The vast majority of textile workers were women, many of them young, many from rural areas where economic opportunities barely existed. Factory work paid modest wages, averaging around $100 to $120 per month in the 2000s, but this income meant everything to families accustomed to scraping by on subsistence farming and irregular casual labor. The textile factories transformed Maseru's landscape. Industrial zones sprang up on the edges of the city, clusters of large corrugated metal buildings surrounded by high fences, with hundreds of workers streaming in and out at shift changes. The factories operated on tight margins, competing with garment manufacturers across Asia and other African countries. They depended entirely on American demand and the tariff preferences granted under AGOA. When the American economy was strong and consumer spending robust, orders flowed and the factories hummed. When recession hit or trade rules changed, the industry contracted immediately. Major American brands sourced garments from Lesotho during the industry's peak years: Gap, Levi Strauss, Walmart, JCPenney, and others. For these retailers, Lesotho offered a combination of AGOA tariff benefits and geographical proximity to South African fabric suppliers and shipping infrastructure. The garments sewn by Lesotho women ended up in shopping malls across the United States, worn by American teenagers and office workers who likely had never heard of Lesotho and certainly didn't think about the women who had stitched their clothing together for $1 an hour. The industry also brought challenges and criticism. Working conditions in some factories were harsh, with long hours, intense pressure to meet production quotas, and limited labor rights. Stories emerged of pregnant workers being fired, of injuries from industrial sewing machines, of supervisors verbally abusing workers. Some factories did implement better standards, including health and disease prevention programs. But overall, textile work represented a difficult choice: accept poor conditions and low wages, or have no formal employment at all. The industry reached its employment peak around 2004, then began a long, slow decline as the global textile market evolved. The end of the multi-fiber arrangement, which had imposed quotas on textile imports into developed countries, unleashed Asian manufacturers to compete more aggressively. Lesotho's factories struggled to match the efficiency and scale of competitors in Vietnam, Bangladesh, and China. Employment in the sector declined from over 50,000 to around 45,000 by 2011 and continued dropping in subsequent years. Some factories closed, others reduced shifts or laid off portions of their workforce. The women who lost these jobs had few alternatives. Many returned to rural areas and subsistence farming. Some found work in informal trading or domestic service. Others joined the ranks of the unemployed, surviving on support from family members. Then came the shock of early 2025. The Trump administration's imposition of high tariffs on textile imports, initially set at levels that made Lesotho's exports uncompetitive, essentially destroyed what remained of the industry within weeks. American retailers canceled orders immediately rather than absorb the higher costs. Factories that had operated for 25 years shut down almost overnight. The Lesotho government declared a state of economic emergency, scrambling to find resources to provide some relief to the suddenly unemployed workers. But with government finances already stretched thin, with no domestic industries ready to absorb tens of thousands of workers, with an economy already struggling before this blow, the options were severely limited. The textile collapse exemplified every vulnerability this chapter describes. Dependence on external markets beyond Lesotho's control, lack of economic diversification, inability to cushion against sudden shocks, and the precarious nature of even the formal employment sector. The women who had sown America's genes for a generation found themselves with nothing, their years of labor suddenly worthless in an economy with no alternatives to offer. Agricultural production illustrates another dimension of economic struggle. Although approximately 70% of Lesotho live in rural areas and most engage in some form of farming, agriculture contributes only about 7% of GDP. The numbers tell a story of enormous effort producing minimal economic return. Families work small plots of land, often less than 2 hectares, using hand tools and animal-drawn plows to grow maize, sorghum, wheat, and beans. The soil is poor and heavily eroded. Rainfall is unpredictable. Drought strikes regularly, sometimes for multiple consecutive years. Even in good years, most farmers produce barely enough to feed their families. Lesotho imports more than 70% of the food its population consumes, primarily from South Africa. The livestock sector provides somewhat more value. Lesotho has substantial sheep and goat herds, and these animals produce wool and mohair that can be exported. Lesotho shepherds, wrapped in traditional blankets and wearing the distinctive mokorotlo hats, tend flocks on mountain pastures, continuing practices that stretch back generations. The wool and mohair are sold to buyers who export to textile manufacturers, primarily in South Africa, China, and Europe. This provides some cash income to herding families, but the amounts are modest and subject to fluctuating global prices for these commodities. The result of all these factors is an economy that fails to provide adequate opportunities for its people. Young Lesotho finish school and face unemployment or underemployment as their most likely outcome. University graduates often cannot find work matching their education level. Skilled workers emigrate to South Africa or further abroad in search of opportunities. Those who remain make do through combinations of informal work, small-scale farming, support from family members abroad, and sheer determination. The poverty is not equally distributed. Urban areas, particularly Maseru, have pockets of relative prosperity where government officials, business owners, and professionals enjoy middle-class lifestyles. But even in the capital, inequality is stark. Modern office buildings and shopping centers stand within sight of sprawling informal settlements where families live in crude shacks without running water or electricity. The countryside faces even deeper poverty, with entire districts where cash income is rare, and most people survive primarily through subsistence farming and mutual aid within extended family networks. Standing in a Maseru market on an ordinary day, watching vendors sell small piles of vegetables, watching shoppers carefully counting coins to pay for a few items, watching women who once worked in now shuttered factories trying to scrape together a living through petty trade, the economic challenges of Lesotho become visceral rather than abstract. This is not a temporary recession or a cyclical downturn. This is structural poverty embedded in an economy too small, too dependent, too vulnerable to sustain its population at anything approaching decent living standards. The mountains that define Lesotho's geography also constrain its economic development, while dependence on South Africa provides both lifeline and limitation, a relationship the country cannot escape but struggles to manage on terms that might lead toward genuine prosperity. Chapter 4. Water Flowing Uphill. The engineer stood at the base of the Katse Dam in late 1995, looking up at the massive concrete wall rising 185 meters above him. The structure curved gracefully across the narrow gorge where the Malibamatso River had flowed freely for millions of years. Behind the dam, water was already beginning to accumulate, slowly drowning the valley that had once been home to scattered Basotho villages. This was the culmination of nearly a decade of continuous construction, an engineering feat that transformed Lesotho from a country with essentially no infrastructure of international significance into the operator of one of Africa's most ambitious water transfer schemes. The idea of harnessing Lesotho's abundant water resources for export to South Africa had been discussed for decades before the first concrete was poured. The concept was simple in theory, but staggeringly complex in execution. Lesotho sits high in the mountains where rainfall is plentiful and numerous rivers begin their journey toward the sea. South Africa, particularly the industrial heartland around Johannesburg and Pretoria, sits on a relatively dry plateau where explosive urban growth and industrial expansion in the 1970s and 80s pushed water demand far beyond what local sources could sustainably supply. The Vaal River system, serving the economic engine of the entire region, faced growing deficits that threatened to constrain development. If you could capture water in Lesotho's mountains and move it hundreds of kilometers to where it was desperately needed, both countries would benefit. Lesotho would gain revenue and electricity. South Africa would secure water for continued growth. The Treaty on the Lesotho Highlands Water Project was signed on October 24, 1986, establishing a massive, multi-billion-dollar undertaking that would eventually span more than 2 decades. The project scale was deliberately ambitious. It called for building multiple large dams in the Lesotho highlands, creating reservoirs to capture and store water, excavating tunnels through solid rock to transfer water northward against its natural flow direction, constructing hydroelectric power stations to generate electricity from the transferred water, and building all the associated roads, bridges, and infrastructure needed to support construction in one of the most remote and rugged regions of southern Africa. The first phase focused on the Katse Dam and a companion facility, the Muela hydropower station. Katse itself represented an engineering challenge of the first order. The dam site lay deep in the Maloti Mountains, accessible only by rough dirt tracks that wound through mountain passes subject to snow closure in winter. Everything needed for construction, from massive earth-moving equipment to the countless tons of cement, had to be transported into the mountains over roads that barely existed. Construction crews had to blast and grade new access routes, build temporary housing for thousands of workers, establish concrete batching plants, and create essentially a small city in a wilderness where the nearest substantial town was hours away by road. The dam design called for a double curvature concrete arch, a structure that curves both horizontally across the gorge and vertically from base to crest. This design transfers the enormous pressure of the water behind the dam into the rock walls of the canyon, allowing a relatively thin concrete structure to hold back immense weight. The dam stretches 710 meters from one side of the gorge to the other, and at its base, the concrete is thick enough to contain rooms and tunnels where workers can monitor the structure's integrity. The reservoir behind Katse, when full, covers an area of approximately 35 square kilometers and holds enough water to supply a major city for months. Construction proceeded through the early 1990s with crews working around the clock. The process of building such a dam in stages requires careful planning and precise execution. First, the river must be diverted through temporary channels or tunnels so the construction site can be kept dry. Then, the foundation must be excavated down to solid bedrock and thoroughly cleaned and prepared. Concrete is poured in layers, with each layer needing time to cure before the next can be added. Cooling pipes are embedded in the concrete because the chemical reaction of cement curing generates tremendous heat, and if that heat is not controlled, the concrete can crack. Temperature monitoring continues for years after construction as the massive structure slowly reaches equilibrium with the surrounding environment. The Katse Dam was completed in 1996, though the entire first phase of the project took until 2004 to finish. On January 22, 1998, water delivery from Katse officially began. The system works through a combination of gravity and pressure. Water flows from the reservoir into intake towers, then enters tunnels that descend through the mountain, passing through the Mwela hydropower station where turbines convert the falling water's energy into electricity. After generating power, the water continues north through transfer tunnels carved through solid rock, eventually emerging in South Africa where it joins the Ash River, a tributary of the Vaal River system that supplies water to the industrial complex around Johannesburg. The transfer tunnels represent perhaps the most impressive part of the entire system, though they remain hidden underground where few people ever see them. The main delivery tunnel runs for 45 kilometers through the mountains, excavated using massive boring machines and blasting techniques. The tunnel walls are lined with concrete to prevent leakage and maintain structural integrity. Inside these tunnels, water flows silently and continuously at rates reaching up to 18 cubic meters per second during peak delivery periods, moving from the highlands of Lesotho to the lowlands of South Africa entirely by gravity, an invisible river that has been redirected from its natural course for human purposes. The Mwela hydropower station harnesses the 200-meter drop between the Katse reservoir and the transfer tunnel to generate 72 megawatts through its 3 turbines. This power output made Lesotho almost completely self-sufficient in electricity production. Before the Highlands Water Project, Lesotho imported virtually all its electricity from South Africa. The technical specifications of the power station allow it to meet essentially all of the country's domestic demand, with only minimal imports needed during maintenance periods or peak consumption. For ordinary Basotho, this means more reliable electricity supply and lower costs, though many rural areas still lack grid connections and continue using candles, kerosene lamps, and wood for cooking and heating. The second major dam in the system, Mohale, was built in a different catchment area and completed in 2004. Mohale stands 145 meters high and creates a reservoir that captures water from the Senkanyane River. This water is transferred through a 32-kilometer tunnel system to the Katse Reservoir, effectively combining the water resources of multiple mountain river basins into a single integrated system. With both Katse and Mohale operational, the project's water delivery capacity reached approximately 700 million cubic meters per year, with the system generating revenue through water sales that became a significant component of government income. The economic calculation from Lesotho's perspective goes beyond just water royalties. The construction phase employed thousands of Basotho workers, providing wages and skills training that had lasting benefits. The roads built to access dam sites opened up remote highland areas that had previously been largely isolated. The Katse Dam has become a tourist attraction, with visitors coming to see the massive structure and visit the Katse Botanical Garden established nearby to preserve highland plant species. More recent initiatives, including solar-powered boreholes and rainwater harvesting systems in water-scarce areas, continue the infrastructure development started by the main project. But the project created stark winners and losers, and not everyone affected views the dams as unambiguous progress. The reservoirs behind Katse and Mohale flooded valleys where Basotho communities had lived for generations. Approximately 7,000 people had to be relocated from the areas to be inundated. The government promised compensation and new housing in resettlement villages, and these commitments were largely fulfilled. Families received new homes built with modern materials, along with payments for lost land and crops. Yet for many displaced people, the compensation could never truly replace what was lost. Those relocated from flooded valleys had to leave land their families had farmed for generations, graves of ancestors, and communities they had known their entire lives. The new houses the government provided were often larger and better built than old homes, with corrugated metal roofs instead of thatch, but they stood in different valleys among strangers. Fields families had cultivated were gone, replaced by blue water stretching back into the mountains. For elderly residents who spent decades in the flooded zones, the displacement meant leaving behind not just physical structures, but an entire way of life rooted in particular landscapes. The environmental impacts extend beyond the human communities that were displaced. Large dams fundamentally alter river ecosystems. Downstream from Katse and Mohale, the rivers no longer flow with their natural seasonal patterns. Floods that once spread across floodplains during summer rainy seasons are now controlled by dam managers opening and closing gates according to water delivery schedules and power generation needs. Fish populations that once migrated upstream to spawn find their routes blocked by concrete walls hundreds of meters high. Riverine vegetation adapted to natural flow patterns struggles with the new regulated regime. Project planners and environmental consultants conducted studies before construction began, and mitigation measures were implemented to address some concerns. But the fundamental reality remains that you cannot build dams of this scale without causing significant environmental disruption. The calculations that justified the project weighed the economic benefits against these costs and determined the benefits outweighed the negatives. Whether you agree with that assessment depends partly on whether you are among those who benefit or among those who bear the costs. The project's governance structure, established by treaty, created the Lesotho Highlands Development Authority as the implementing agency on the Lesotho side and a corresponding authority in South Africa. These agencies have operated with substantial budgets and considerable autonomy, managing not just dam construction, but also compensation programs, environmental monitoring, tourism development around the dams, and community development initiatives in affected areas. The dual authority structure was designed to ensure both countries have input into decisions, while maintaining professional management insulated from day-to-day political interference. The system did not prove entirely immune to corruption. In the early 2000s, investigations revealed that several major construction companies had paid bribes to Lesotho officials to secure contracts for dam construction work. Masufa Sole, the chief executive of the Lesotho Highlands Development Authority from 1986 to 1997, was convicted of accepting bribes totaling roughly $2 million from multiple companies competing for lucrative construction contracts. The scandal emerged through investigations initiated by the World Bank and Lesotho's Directorate on Corruption and Economic Offenses. Sol was sentenced to 18 years in prison, though he served only a portion of that sentence before being released on parole. Companies involved in the bribery also faced prosecution in their home countries, with mixed results. The scandal damaged the project's reputation and raised questions about oversight mechanisms, but the dams themselves were already built and operational by the time the corruption was fully exposed, and water continued flowing north to South Africa throughout the legal proceedings. The success of the first phase led to planning for expansion. Future phases envision additional dams in other catchments, more transfer tunnels, and potentially a pumped storage scheme that would use excess electricity during low demand periods to pump water uphill into high reservoirs, then release it through turbines during peak demand to generate power when it is most valuable. The proposed Polahali Dam would become the largest dam in the system, creating a reservoir even larger than Katse. But these future phases remain on drawing boards and in feasibility studies, awaiting financing, political will, and resolution of various technical and social concerns. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project stands as the most significant infrastructure achievement in the country's history. It demonstrated that Lesotho could plan, construct, and operate major engineering works. It provided crucial revenue that supports government budgets. It achieved electricity self-sufficiency. It opened previously inaccessible highland areas to development. Yet it also illustrated the contradictions inherent in development projects in poor countries. The water flows north to South Africa. The electricity powers homes and businesses primarily in the lowlands where most Basotho live. The revenue helps government finances, but has not translated into dramatic improvements in living standards for most people. The engineering triumph did not solve the fundamental economic challenges. Standing on the crest of the Katsi Dam today, looking out across the blue water of the reservoir stretching back into the mountains, with the roar of water flowing through the power station audible even here, the achievement is undeniable. Lesotho, a small mountain kingdom with limited resources and enormous challenges, built this. But looking down into the valley below the dam, where a thin stream of released water winds through a channel that once held a river, where villages once stood that are now gone, the costs are equally undeniable. The transformation is permanent, the landscape reshaped by human determination to make nature serve economic purposes, for better and for worse. Chapter 5. When Death Came for a Generation. The clinic in Roma, a small town 32 kilometers from Maseru, opens its doors at 7 in the morning, but patients begin gathering outside well before dawn. By the time the nurse unlocks the entrance, 20 or 30 people wait quietly in the cold morning air, wrapped in blankets against the chill. Their breath makes small clouds in the darkness. Someone coughs, the sound sharp in the stillness. Most are women, wearing thick woolen shawls and rubber shoes. Some are young, in their 20s. Others are middle-aged, mothers and grandmothers. A few men stand apart from the main group, their faces carefully neutral, revealing nothing. They have all come for the same reason, though no one speaks it aloud. They have come for their antiretroviral medications, the pills that keep them alive. Inside, fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting harsh white light across the waiting room's concrete floor. The nurse greets each patient by name. She knows them all. In a town as small as Roma, everyone knows everyone, and the fiction that this is just another medical clinic fools no one. The people who come here every month are living with HIV. In Lesotho, that statement describes an astonishing proportion of the adult population. Approximately 23% of adults in the country carry the virus that causes AIDS. In some demographic groups, the numbers climb even higher. Among women aged 20 to 39 in urban areas, infection rates approach 40%. This means that in a room of 10 young urban women, 4 are likely HIV positive. These statistics, stark as they are, barely capture the magnitude of the crisis that has devastated Lesotho over the past 3 decades. To understand what HIV/AIDS has meant for this mountain kingdom, you must understand what it has done to families, to communities, to the basic fabric of society. You must understand how it has killed, and continues to kill, the most productive members of the population, leaving behind orphans and elderly people struggling to survive without the support of the generation that should be caring for them. The virus arrived in southern Africa in the 1980s, spreading initially through urban areas and along transportation corridors before penetrating into rural regions. Lesotho, with its pattern of male labor migration to South African mines and cities, proved particularly vulnerable. Men working far from home for months at a time engaged in relationships with women in the mining towns and cities where they lived. When they returned home to their villages, they brought the virus with them, infecting wives who had no knowledge of their husbands' activities abroad and no power to insist on condom use even if they suspected risk.
The infection spread with terrible efficiency through networks of sexual relationships that connected migrant workers, their wives in Lesotho, other partners in South Africa, sex workers in mining towns, and onward through chains of transmission that crossed borders and linked urban and rural areas. By the early 2000s, Lesotho had one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world. The UN estimated in 2001 that prevalence among adults between 15 and 49 stood at 30.1%, an almost incomprehensible number. By 2009, health officials counted over 260,000 patients and carriers of the virus. The impact on life expectancy revealed the scale of the catastrophe in the starkest possible terms. In 1989, before AIDS became widespread, the average Basotho could expect to live 60 years. This was not high by global standards, but represented steady improvement from previous decades. By 2006, average life expectancy had collapsed to just 42 years. Think about what that means. The average person born in Lesotho could expect to die before reaching middle age. This placed Lesotho among the lowest life expectancies in the entire world, comparable to countries experiencing active warfare or extreme poverty, far worse than Lesotho's already difficult economic situation.
The deaths clustered heavily in the prime working years. The mortality rate for people between 15 and 60 years old reached 78.65%, meaning that more than 3/4 of people who entered their productive adult years would die before reaching old age. This represented an almost complete inversion of normal demographic patterns, where most deaths occur either in early childhood or in old age, with the middle years being relatively safe. In Lesotho, during the worst years of the epidemic, the middle years became the most dangerous. For individual families, this translated into tragedy repeated thousands of times across the country. Palesa Moeti was 32 years old when she began feeling constantly tired and developing recurring infections that would not heal. She lived in a village in Laribe district with her 3 children and her husband's elderly mother. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, officially from tuberculosis, though everyone suspected it was AIDS. Palesa went to the clinic and was tested. The result came back positive. She was HIV infected, and given the progression of her symptoms, she had likely been carrying the virus for several years. At that time, in the early 2000s, antiretroviral treatment was not yet widely available in Lesotho. The medications existed, but they were expensive, and the country's health system lacked the capacity to provide them to everyone who needed them. Palesa received some treatment for her opportunistic infections, but there was little else the clinic could do. Over the next year, her health deteriorated steadily. She lost weight despite eating, her body consuming itself. Painful sores erupted in her mouth, making it difficult to swallow. She developed a persistent cough that racked her thin frame. Her energy drained away until she could barely manage the daily tasks of fetching water and cooking meals. Her youngest child, only 6 years old, watched her mother shrink and weaken, not understanding why. Her middle daughter, 10, tried to help with chores while keeping up with school. Eventually, Palesa became bedridden, cared for by her oldest daughter, who was 14, and her mother-in-law, who was 68. When Palesa died, she left 3 orphans. Her husband's mother, already elderly and with her own health problems, suddenly had to care for 3 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. The family had no other adult members to help. Both Palesa and her husband had been only children, and their parents were all either dead or too old to provide support. The oldest daughter dropped out of school to help care for her younger siblings and her grandmother. This family's story was not unusual. It was being repeated in village after village across Lesotho. The epidemic created an orphan crisis of staggering proportions. By the mid-2000s, estimates suggested that approximately 150,000 children in Lesotho had lost one or both parents to AIDS. In a country with a total population of around 2 million, this meant that roughly 15% of all children were orphans. Traditional extended family networks, which had historically absorbed orphan children into households of aunts, uncles, or grandparents, became overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Elderly grandparents found themselves raising multiple grandchildren with no working-age adults to provide labor or income. Thabo was 12 when both his parents died within 6 months of each other. He became responsible for his 3 younger siblings, aged 10, 7, and 4. Their grandmother came to live with them initially, but she was too frail to manage the household, so Thabo found himself making decisions about money, food, and school attendance. He woke before dawn to fetch water, prepared breakfast for his siblings, walked the younger ones to school, then went to his own classes exhausted. After school, there were chores, homework to supervise, dinner to make. At night, he lay awake worrying about where the next week's food would come from or whether they could afford to repair the leaking roof before the rainy season. He was a child trying to do the work of 3 adults, and it was crushing him. Some orphans ended up in child-headed households like Thabos, where teenagers as young as 12 or 13 took on responsibility for younger siblings, trying to keep families together and children in school while managing adult responsibilities they were far too young to handle. The economic impact extended far beyond individual families. Agriculture, which employed the majority of rural Lesotho, suffered severe disruption as the disease killed farmers in their most productive years. Fields went unplanted or were planted late because there was no one healthy enough to plow and sow at the right time. Harvests declined, not just because of drought or poor soil, but because the knowledge and labor needed to farm effectively died with the farmers. The death of skilled workers in every sector created gaps that were difficult to fill. Schools lost teachers, clinics lost nurses, businesses lost experienced employees. The loss of human capital set back economic development by years or even decades. The government response to the crisis was slow and inadequate for many years. Part of the problem was denial. In the early years of the epidemic, when prevention might have made the biggest difference, there was reluctance to acknowledge the scale of the problem or to implement controversial prevention measures. Condom distribution faced resistance from conservative religious groups and from men who refused to use them. Public education campaigns about HIV transmission struggled against cultural taboos that made it difficult to discuss sex openly. Traditional healers sometimes provided false hope with remedies that had no effect on the virus, while discouraging patients from seeking medical care that might actually help. As the death toll mounted through the late 1990s and early 2000s, denial became impossible to maintain. The evidence was everywhere, in the funerals that occurred weekly in every village, in the orphans being raised by grandparents, in the clinics overwhelmed with patients suffering from tuberculosis and other opportunistic infections that signaled underlying AIDS. In the peak years of the epidemic, over 30,000 Lesotho residents signed a petition requesting that the country be annexed by South Africa. They had lost hope that Lesotho as an independent nation could address the crisis or provide a future for its people. The petition was rejected, but the fact that it was submitted revealed the depth of despair felt by ordinary Lesotho watching their country consumed by disease. International assistance finally began flowing in substantial amounts by the mid-2000s. The United States government, through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, known as PEPFAR, committed nearly $1 billion to help Lesotho deal with HIV between 2006 and the present. This funding supported prevention programs, care services, and, crucially, the provision of antiretroviral medications that could turn HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Other donors, including the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, the World Bank, and various European governments also provided significant support. The availability of antiretroviral treatment transformed the epidemic from a crisis of death into a crisis of chronic disease management. The medications work by interfering with the virus's ability to replicate inside human cells. Patients must take pills every day, usually a combination of several different drugs, and they must continue taking them for the rest of their lives. If they stop, the virus rebounds and disease progression resumes. The drugs have side effects that can be unpleasant, though newer medication regimens are better tolerated than the early versions. Most importantly, the drugs work. Patients who take them consistently can live essentially normal lifespans, with the virus suppressed to levels where it causes minimal damage and is very difficult to transmit to others. Scaling up treatment access in Lesotho required building clinical capacity that had not previously existed. Health workers needed training in how to prescribe and monitor antiretroviral therapy. Supply chains had to be established to ensure medications reached clinics reliably, even in remote mountain districts. Laboratory systems had to be developed to test patients' viral loads and CD4 counts, the key measures of how well treatment is working. All of this required money, expertise, and sustained effort over many years. China has played a significant role in supporting Lesotho's health system, sending medical teams to work in hospitals and clinics since 2011. These Chinese doctors and nurses, typically deployed in teams of a dozen or more medical personnel at a time, work in facilities like Queen Mamahato Memorial Hospital in Maseru and district hospitals in areas like Mokhotlong and Kwacha's Nek. They bring expertise in fields including surgery, internal medicine, obstetrics, and emergency care, working alongside Lesotho healthcare providers and helping to fill gaps in medical coverage. The presence of foreign medical personnel highlights both the international support Lesotho receives and the ongoing shortage of domestic healthcare workers, many of whom emigrate to South Africa or other countries where they can earn better salaries. By the mid-2010s, the tide had begun to turn. Life expectancy started climbing back up from its nadir of 42 years. By 2019, it had recovered to 54 years, still well below pre-epidemic levels, but moving in the right direction. The number of new infections declined as prevention efforts took effect and as treatment programs reduced transmission by suppressing viral loads in people already infected. The percentage of adults living with HIV stabilized at approximately 22.9% by 2013, though it remained among the highest in the world. The textile industry, before its collapse in 2025, implemented the Apparel Lesotho Alliance to Fight AIDS, an industry-wide program providing disease prevention information and treatment access to factory workers. This represented one of the more successful workplace-based responses to the epidemic, reaching tens of thousands of young women who faced particularly high infection risk. The program demonstrated that systematic, well-funded interventions could make a difference, though its impact was limited by the eventual closure of the factories. Despite the progress, enormous challenges remain. Approximately 300 to 400,000 Lesotho live with HIV today. All of them require lifelong treatment and medical monitoring. The health system must provide these services sustainably while also addressing other health needs, including maternal and child health, tuberculosis, and non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease. The financial burden is substantial and depends heavily on continued international donor support. If that support were to decline or end, Lesotho's health system would struggle to maintain current service levels. Stigma continues to complicate prevention and treatment efforts. Many people still face discrimination if their HIV status becomes known. Women in particular risk abandonment by partners, rejection by families, or loss of economic support if they test positive. This fear of stigma discourages some people from getting tested in the first place, which means they do not learn their status until they are already sick with advanced disease. It also discourages some who test positive from seeking treatment promptly or from disclosing their status to sexual partners, which facilitates ongoing transmission. The orphan crisis, though no longer growing as rapidly as it did during the worst years, still affects hundreds of thousands of children. Many are now reaching adulthood, having grown up in child-headed households or in the care of elderly grandparents, with all the educational and economic disadvantages that come from such unstable childhood circumstances. Breaking the cycle of poverty and vulnerability for these young people requires sustained social support and economic opportunities that Lesotho struggles to provide given its limited resources. The intersection of HIV/AIDS with poverty creates a vicious cycle. Poverty increases vulnerability to infection because people lack resources to negotiate safe sex, to leave risky relationships, or to access prevention tools. Infection then deepens poverty by causing illness that prevents work, by requiring expenditure on healthcare, and by killing productive adults who are supporting dependents. Public health interventions can interrupt this cycle, but only if they address both the medical and the socioeconomic dimensions of the epidemic. The intersection of HIV/AIDS with poverty creates a vicious cycle. Poverty increases vulnerability to infection because people lack resources to negotiate safe sex, to leave risky relationships, or to access prevention tools. Infection then deepens poverty by causing illness that prevents work, by requiring expenditure on healthcare, and by killing productive adults who were supporting dependents. Public health interventions can interrupt this cycle, but only if they address both the medical and the socioeconomic dimensions of the epidemic. Looking ahead, Lesotho faces the challenge of sustaining its HIV response while building a broader health system capable of addressing all health needs. The focus on AIDS over the past 2 decades has created strong HIV programs, but other areas of health have received less attention and investment. Maternal mortality remains high. Child malnutrition persists in many areas. Access to basic health services is limited in remote rural districts where clinics may be hours away on foot or horseback. Creating a truly comprehensive health system will require resources that Lesotho does not have on its own, and sustained international support that cannot be guaranteed indefinitely. The AIDS epidemic has left permanent scars on Lesotho's society, economy, and culture. An entire generation was decimated, leaving demographic gaps that will be visible for decades. Traditional social structures were disrupted when the disease killed so many adults in their prime years. Economic development was set back by the loss of human capital and the diversion of resources to emergency health response. Yet, Lesotho have endured, supported by international assistance, but ultimately relying on their own resilience and determination to survive a catastrophe that at its worst seemed likely to destroy the nation entirely. In the clinic in Roma, the nurse hands patients their monthly medication supplies and reminds them about the importance of adherence, of taking every dose on schedule. Most of these patients will live for many more years, leading productive lives, raising children, contributing to their communities. This represents success, though success defined by survival rather than by cure. The virus still circulates, new infections still occur, but the crisis of death has become a challenge of chronic disease management. For a country that watched life expectancy collapse by nearly 20 years in less than 2 decades, even this qualified success represents an achievement worth acknowledging, even as the work of building a healthier future continues. Lesotho stands as a study in contradictions. A nation defined by mountains that both protect and isolate. A democracy that has survived repeated crises yet struggles to deliver prosperity. An economy that exports its most precious resource, water, while its people seek work across borders. A society that endured one of the world's worst AIDS epidemics yet continues to rebuild. The kingdom in the sky reminds us that geography shapes destiny, but it does not determine it. The Lesotho have carved out independence in one of the world's most challenging environments, maintaining their identity against enormous odds. Yet independence without opportunity, sovereignty without prosperity, survival without thriving, these are the tensions Lesotho lives with daily. As you return from this journey through the highlands, consider what resilience truly costs, and what it means to persist when the odds are stacked against you. The story of Lesotho continues, written each day by 2 million people living in the vertical realm. Thank you for listening.